Thank you very much, Lena Nemirovskaya, and all distinguished guests and dear friends. I'm not sure I was aware of the challenge when Lena and her colleagues asked me to speak here about 6 months ago when we met in Tallinn. But I bring the greetings of the federal president, not the federal government, but the federal president. But what I have to say, I say mostly in a personal capacity, because I think for the issues you discuss, it might be more helpful also to give a more personal account of where I see Germany, and you've talked about how you see this country's task and role, but also our reflection on where we are and what is happening around us, trying to make sense of it. So I will start also with my own thoughts on the 9th of November 1989. I was 24 at the time. I was studying international politics, but I certainly didn't see coming what was happening then. And I remember I was sitting in an American university computer lab because we didn't have our own computers. And there were friends coming in and saying, Thomas, they're taking the wall down, they're taking the wall down. And I thought, these crazy Americans, they must have gotten something wrong because they couldn't possibly talk about this wall. And when I reflect upon the importance of that year and those events that changed my life, the life of my country, the life on this continent, I think it was so powerful that looking back, I think it was only natural that we fell into something that you might call an expectations trap or exaggerated expectations. And in Germany, it was very popular for many years to expect sort of what I call a grand convergence. At least the west of the country, West Germany, had arrived at its final destination in history, after having been on the wrong side at least twice in the last century. Parliamentary democracy, a social market economy. Everybody else would need to change, but not us. And that is how Germany transformed very much into a status quo power, very happy with the way things were and things had become. And we were, in our own perspective, I think, we were no longer trying to recover from a terrible past and to reintegrate, but we thought we were the future. We suddenly represented the future. The avant-garde, certainly, of the European Union, but even globally, with the rise of the trading state, the growing irrelevance of military power. And I remember the days when I joined the German Foreign Service in 1992, and I started in the European division. We loved writing. We were accustomed to writing into our speaking notes for our ministers about the irreversible process of European integration. And it's interesting when you think about it, the irreversible process, because, was that a normative statement or an analytical statement? I think the truth is we didn't think about it like that in those days because it didn't matter. There was not much of a difference between the two, so why would you need to differentiate? What should happen would happen. That's how we felt about it, and we didn't even much think about it because it seemed so obvious. And both sort of that had an internal domestic political component, sort of liberal values, liberal democracy, but it also had an international politics component where we were certain that power as the currency of international politics would be gradually supplanted by international law and a rules-based system. And when I look back over these 30 years, I think sort of from a German point of view, the high watermark of this expectation was probably the establishment of the International Criminal Court in 1998, which for many Germans was a translation of their own post-war experience of the Nuremberg trials into the establishment of an international judicial body that would be able to judge and administer judgments for crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression, and so forth. But in a way, it was also seen, at least here, as a gradual shift from sort of power as the currency towards international law. And it took us a long time to realize that while Germany's historical lessons seemed perfectly in sync with the world events for quite a while, they were actually not in perfect harmony. And I don't want to go through all of the events in detail, but you can think about it, you know them yourself. The financial crisis of 2008, sort of, did the West really know what it was doing? I think we still underestimate the loss of credibility that entailed in large parts of the world. That's true for Russia, but that's especially true for China as well, but also for many others, and for many within our own societies. You can think about the Arab Spring in 2011, where I felt in Germany we had a perspective that was largely still the prism of 1989. Essentially, for us, the Arab Spring was the Arab world's 1989, until it wasn't. You could point to the ascent of Xi Jinping as the new leader in Beijing, or the return of Vladimir Putin to the Kremlin in 2011, 2012. But I think from a German point of view, it was really the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass that proved to be a turning point where we felt sort of the world no longer conforms to our expectations. And I think many in Russia, also from my Russian contacts and colleagues, to this day, they underestimate the genuine shock in German political circles and the wider public of what was happening then, that this post-war and post-Cold War order of a stable, peaceful Europe with guaranteed borders was no longer, because it was again borders changed by force on this continent, not in some faraway place. And therefore they underestimate the consequences of for the transformation also on our perspective on Russia and the current government in Moscow. But I think if you look at 2014, I would say 2014 for Germany was the turning point where we felt things were off in an unexpected and not positive direction. I think it was the double shock of the Brexit referendum in June 2016 and then the election of Donald Trump as the US president in November that really brought home the message that the triumph of liberal democracy was not only challenged from outside by what you might call revisionist powers, but was actually challenged from within. And I say all that because I think in a nutshell, I believe when I reflect on these last 30 years, the Germans had a tendency, many Germans, and I include myself, we had a tendency to over-universalize our own very particular historical experience. We loved the idea that our exception would become the global norm. And that's why we struggle today with the realization that the world no longer conforms to our expectations. In a way, the future is far more open than we wanted it to be. But I don't tell this as a sort of farewell to the idea of universal ideas and values. For me, that is rather a call both for more humility and more curiosity. More humility because I think we need to reflect on the limits of our own capabilities. I think in many ways, every country, every people has to chart its own path to democracy and to the realization of a more open society. We cannot fix things entirely from outside, is a lesson we've also learned over these decades. And then secondly, more curiosity. An end to grand generalizations or to the theory of grand convergence. It's something I've discovered also over these last few years in many travels with my president, who's made the future of democracy the signature theme of his term in office. But every country and every culture is different in its own right, and every democracy as well. And the one in Colombia is very different from the one in Ecuador. and be it only because in one country you have 30% indigenous people and in the other country you have 3% indigenous people. It changes a lot of things. And so it's actually worth looking carefully and being curious about local traditions, local cultures, local institutions. And to acknowledge that is not to fall into the trap of cultural relativism, but I think it is in the differences between these various cultures and their political translations that we get to know ourselves better also. So we live now, when you follow German debates, with a profound sense of disappointed expectations, with a sense of deep transformation and uncertainty. And I think sometimes also with the danger of a second trap, which is the trap of another linear projection that declares authoritarianism the winner of the day. And I think that would be just as wrong as assuming that we would just administer the inevitable after the fall of the wall and the unification of Europe in 1989. So when I reflect on where do we go from here, I'd like to offer three thoughts. The first is aspiration. I think that universal values, in the way you've discussed it, are really, as a normative horizon, are still very much intact. And when I look around to what some are calling the second Arabellion, but a lot of the revolts and protests in the Arab world, when you look to Latin America, when you look to what has happened in Hong Kong in the recent, and be they only local elections, I think you still, you can see that people all over the globe are claiming decency, hope, justice, an independent judiciary, individual freedoms. It is not something that you can sort of define away or that has simply disappeared because you have more repressive regimes. So that is very much intact, and I think that is sort of maybe the most important thing not to forget, that this aspiration is indeed universal, even across all cultural differences. The second is reason. I think that is particularly interesting. We had a guest at an event my president did on Monday this week, where Harvard professor Steven Pinker was there, who's written a book on Enlightenment Now, where he, with a lot of empirical evidence, makes the case how the world has actually made progress on almost every indicator he can think of. But it's slow progress. 1989 in many ways is unique because it was a single event that seemed to change the world for the better. His argument is usually that happens slowly, whereas only the catastrophes happen suddenly and in a singular event, or conflict, or accidents, or attacks, things like that. That is why 89 is so important in our minds, because we thought we could distill progress in that day and in that year. But so he makes this case that we're progressing very well. Reason and an evidence-based policy is making enormous progress. And yet at the same time, clearly reason as an instrument to a better world is challenged. It's challenged by complexity. Do we really understand what we're doing? It is challenged by changing discourse, and that gets you to the whole theme I think you will discuss also on media and the way political discourse is taking place today, also in open societies. Also by foreign interference. But it's still the best instrument we have. And I think, I'm reminded by this old quip of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who used to say, "You are entitled to your own opinion, but not to your own facts." And I think it's really worth reflecting whether we can keep that truth intact, or whether that is no longer true, that you're not entitled to your own facts. and what can we do about that? I think, I mean, on a broad level, I don't think there is a more important answer than education to this challenge, but it's clear that reason as a way to arrive at the best possible policy in a given situation is challenged around the globe and also in our own societies. And the third element, the third thought beyond aspiration and reason is optimism, which in this country also is sometimes in short supply, to the astonishment of many visitors who come here from the outside and look around and think it's actually a rather well-working place. But to me, when I reflect, I think that is the true and the remaining lesson of 1989. I don't want to dismiss it, because as I said, it has changed my own life and the life of this country. But 1989 still represents hope under the most adverse circumstances. It stands for the fact that the unthinkable can happen. I could not imagine it. And I remember when I came back from the US, I went back to study in Munich, and in November I took a little bus with my girlfriend, and we went to Prague into the night, slept there, got up the next morning, and I looked at the scenery of Prague, of the Hradčín, and I said, this has always been here, and I didn't even know about it. I mean, we didn't share pictures of nice places the way you do today, but for me, it was an eye-opener, really, at the time. And I think this fact that the future is open and that individuals do make a difference is the most important antidote to this temptation of a sort of what I call a linear pessimism, that somehow after our optimism was exaggerated, now we exaggerate our pessimism. So in Germany, I think we are at an interesting moment where we try to find the right balance between self-criticism as a strength to make yourself better and self-doubt as a weakness that sort of paralyzes and lets you lose your way. I think we are on the cusp of a debate on Germany's role in the world. How do we properly translate the lessons of our difficult history into a policy that is up to date for the challenges of today? I believe that European integration really is Germany's prime responsibility on the international stage to make it work. I think we have a new European Commission being hopefully confirmed as we speak in these moments. And entering a new institutional cycle with fresh ideas and fresh people at the helm. I think Germany needs to do more for European security. I think it needs to invest more into Europe's cohesion. I think also it needs to listen more to keep Europe united. And I'll leave you with an idea that I owe to a project we've done together with Ivan Krastev over the last few years, and he has come up with this formula of sort of Europe and the European Union needs to be more of a monastery instead of the missionary of years past. And the point is sort of to focus on living up to its own standards rather than trying to lecture others around the globe, but to still bet on the power of its own example. And I say that because I don't want it to be misunderstood as a retreat. He calls it a chastised liberalism. But on defending liberty and fundamental rights in the age of unlimited surveillance capabilities, on setting standards, on data regulation and privacy, on Europe as an ambitious actor in combating climate change and really leading the way to a carbon-free economy, I think there's plenty sort of examples Europe can set, even if it understands the limits of its own capabilities. And so to conclude, I think we can no longer expect the inevitability of a better future, but we should also never discard its possibility. And that includes the emancipation of those who today suffer the consequences of authoritarian rule. Thank you very much.
Thomas. Thomas, thank you so much. And I would like to request that you should open right now a discussion or time for comments, for Q&A. And I would like you to make use of this time so that we have here with us somebody who really is instrumental in determining what German policy would be like. And Germany is one of the central states within the EU. What is his vision of the future development, especially given that we all know that there now what is in store for every one of us with Brexit? John will have a say on this about Brexit, but I think it's very important what is the perspective of Germany from the heartland of Europe. And please, all those present, please take part in this discussion, Q&A, comments. We still have an hour to go for this. Well, thank you very much. Yes. So you will be the first, please, John.
I wondered if I could ask you. It seemed to me there was a kind of contradiction in what you were saying. One was that the chastised liberalism, which you talked about, had recognised that every society had to find its way to democracy in its own way. But you also said it towards the end of your talk that Germany must continue to be the main motor of integration in Europe. Are you now saying that integration has, at least for the moment, a limited road to run, and that the ambition, for example, I think uniquely in Europe, of President Macron, is outside of that possibility, for the moment at least, and that integration means facing up to the list that you gave at the end, climate change, so forth, but not a bringing together of the economies into one fiscal union, not bringing together politics into one centre.
Yeah, you know, there is a, when I think about Germany's role in all of this, there is I have another contradiction that I will offer to you. It is that, you know, in many ways, this country is challenged by a world of returning great power competition and a world in which we have a US president essentially going out and saying there is no such thing as an international community. Every country is out there for him or herself in the pursuit of national interest. And if you can imagine to a certain degree how this country as it is today is a product of enlightened American policies after the World War, you get a sense of how this twist of the argument is really in many ways pulling the rug from under the feet of German post-war foreign policy. So if I boil it down to a very simple level, I would say there are two essential lessons that this country drew from its terrible past. One is never again, and the second is never alone. And I think they both have a lot to them. I mean, this is a sort of, it's a more complex argument, but these are the two fundamental lessons. And if you make the case that this country has never found a way to address the challenges of history and geography as the largest country at the center of this continent, or in the words ascribed to Henry Kissinger of being sort of too small for the world but too big for Europe, then you actually come to the conclusion that European integration is the only successful answer we've ever given to this dual challenge of Germany's history and geography. And I mean, I've been brought up in that tradition, and I believe absolutely it to be true. And the contradiction is here that, we see how the world around us is changing, that maybe for the first time we have all the great powers, Russia, China, and the US, the current administration, no longer interested in the success of that European integration project. Now, that is a strategic challenge, but it does not translate into a real sense of urgency here in Germany. Because then again, we sit at the center of the continent. We've done very well economically over these past 15 years. We have a history of political stability. So the dramatic analysis and the lack of urgency in responding to it are sort of a strange phenomenon in many ways. But it is, on the other hand, it is sort of a very human thing, that you become the victim of your own success, right? We believe that what we've done in the past has worked perfectly well for us, so why change it? Now, on European integration, that has worked very well for us, but that's why I said we need to listen more if we want to keep Europe united, because it hasn't quite worked so well for other member states in that European Union. And I won't go into the specifics of the British argument of why they think it's better outside than inside, or 52% believed that when they voted in June 2016. But sort of I think there is a realization that that project can only succeed when all of these countries are able to define their own interests in a way that is enlightened enough, broad enough, long-term enough to include also their neighbors and their partners in the European Union. So the project of European integration is challenged in a particular way by sort of a more populist or more nationalist turn in politics. You can have that in national political systems, and it can even renew your own political system. It creates new parties, it re-energizes others, it transforms politics, and then you arrive into a new cycle. The problem with Europe is not that it explodes or disintegrates. I don't think the risk is really that there are many who would follow the British example. The risk, in my view, is another one, that if you have more and more countries defining their own interests in a narrow and short-term perspective, you sort of dry up the space in Brussels around the common table where you can actually forge political compromise in the interest of all. Because it's all very short-term. It's not an iterative game where if you win today, you have to pay tomorrow, or where you invest something today because you expect something back tomorrow. It all becomes very narrow and short-term. And that's the real risk for European integration. And I think Germany would be well advised to sort of do more, invest more, listen more into keeping that space for compromise open. And there are many ways to do that. We will always have a different style in doing that than the French will. But I think it's quite clear that there is no progress if the Germans and the French, with their very different methodology, do not arrive at a common initiative, which is not sufficient, but still indispensable for Europe to move forward. And I would not I think you have tendencies that work both ways. You have a disintegrating international order and more pressure on Europe, which should serve to drive home the cost of non-Europe to all Europeans and therefore serve as an accelerator of integration. But of course, you also have very different reactions of individual European member states to individual pressures and individual incentives, whether that is, you take the Russia debate that we have inside the European Union, or you take the debate on China and its influence. You have the very different perspectives on the current US administration, which is nowhere near as unpopular in our in our Polish neighborhood as he is here in Germany. So there are plenty of fault lines and divisions there as well. And I can't judge which way this is going, and I wouldn't define limits right now. But again, in the end, what becomes of Europe will depend on on our own actions, but there's nothing predetermined there. I just think the necessity has grown, the challenges have also grown. Which one comes out on top, I seriously don't know.
Благодарю. Светлана Шмелева.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm Svetlana Shmelyov from Moscow. Thank you for your presentation and for this discussion, for this opportunity. If I may, before this forum, I had a chance to meet some friends here in Berlin, and they were telling me, of course, about this jubilee spirit of the 30th anniversary of the fall of Berlin Wall, which is certainly of high import for us in present and in the future. And two accents or two emphases somewhat have surprised me. Originally, it was thought that, or at least there was a tendency to think that the East or the Eastern Europe did not benefit as much as the West. However, now it is being understood that this universalist spirit, the idealistic spirit of post-war era, has to an extent been lost. I do not know if you're feeling it, or at least this integrationist urge has certainly subsided. And secondly, I was very much surprised that some stories that have been told, that when a decision on felling of the wall was taken, and the person who declared it said, "When should we do it? We'll do it now." But the man who was declaring this or announcing this, he said that we are going to consider this. But then people literally ran to the wall and started dismantling it. So it may be that the public sentiment may be so strong that it is as if we could just stand up and run out of the wall to do something. And in the same way, it seems that this movement of people may be so strong. So our disillusionment or disenchantment should not be too strong, because there is this international movement and the logic of the international movements, which is in some ways self-sufficient, and we should probably be counting on ourselves as much as on international organizations. It may be that we should ask ourselves as to what we should do as citizens, because organizations, manifestos, statements made on the part of states and governments are fine, but one should also not discard the fervor and the urge of the masses. Because in Chinese language, the word challenge and crisis have two hieroglyphs. One, it's a danger, and the other is an opportunity. These two hieroglyphs come together in Chinese.
Thank you for these questions. I think, in the celebrations this year on the 30th anniversary had a different character than they had 10 years ago. And there were many more question marks as well, because because we have a more polarized political landscape in our own country, because we have a party that openly questions the more pro-European liberal outlook of this country that has taken 20% plus in regional elections in the East. So the question is, how do people feel about what has happened 30 years ago has become much more complex and differentiated. It's not a linear, it was not a linear adaptation. It's not only not a linear success story, it's also not a linear adaptation individually. People have second thoughts about it, they think about what they've lost, they're trying to cope with the speed of change, which I think has been a great challenge to many. Because they've been through very disruptive periods. But you can, I think you can see it also when you look to the countries in Central Europe, to the Slovak Republic, to the Czech Republic, which has just seen the largest mass demonstrations since 1989 in the protest of what they call an abuse of power by the current government and the current prime minister. So I think a lot of that spirit is still very much alive, but it is part of a more polarized political system, and where a sense of nostalgia or being overpowered or looking for security in the past conflicts with a more open attitude towards the future. Your second point is very interesting, because we've been through all of these stories and individual events, which culminated in the 9th of November, when the wall was actually breached open. But there's a long run-up to this story, and it's interesting when you listen to those people from East Germany who were part of the action in those days. They will tell you the 9th of November was not really the most remarkable day. Many would point to the 9th of October and the demonstration in Leipzig. And they tell you that up until that day, the greatest fear in August and September, when the crisis was brewing, was that there would be what they called a Chinese solution, a Tiananmen solution by the regime. And so the big demonstration in Leipzig on the 9th of October, which brought about 70,000 people into the streets of Leipzig. And in the end, it happened peacefully. So there was no shooting, no violence, no crackdown. And there are many who would remember today, they said, that was the day when fear changed sides. So that was the day when the people who were afraid of a Chinese solution and weren't sure whether they wanted to take that risk and really go into the streets to protest, when they felt that the regime on the other side, the party, the police, the army, they were actually afraid of them and not the other way around. And that's when the process accelerated. And I think it's hard to understand what happened on the 9th of November without remembering this psychological shift. Because you're right, the Schabowski moment in the press conference where he reads the liberalization of travel regulations, and then he is asked, so when does that take effect? And he looks at his notes and there's nothing on there, and he says, I think this is immediately. And then people sort of start marching, driving towards the border, and the border guards have no instructions. And they keep the border closed for an hour, and then they have 10,000 people there, and then finally that night they simply open it because they don't get any orders, because there's chaos at the heart of the system. So what seemed to be unbreakable, solid, suddenly is disintegrating, and the people take charge. I think that is a very special moment. To me, it is always a reminder that very often when you think about complex political events or systems, it is much closer to reality when you think about them in terms of chaos than in terms of a conspiracy or a master plan or something like that, because there was no master plan. There was sort of emergency, trying to let some steam out of the pot to calm the situation, and then it exploded, and people just sort of went through the wall. But it was also because none of the police and the army felt that there was still an option of violent repression. because that had already changed in early October in Leipzig and in what happened afterwards. So I think that is that's an interesting lesson also. But you can't take also there. You can't universalize it. You can't say this is the way it will eventually happen in Hong Kong. Who knows? There may be a very different end to that story, or in other places.
Mr. Bagger, thank you very much for your talk. And I was a student at Humboldt University in 93, 94, and I remember the energy. Mikhail Minakov from Kiev, Ukraine. I remember this energy and the spirit of reunited city, of reunited community, of reunited country. And I really enjoy these memories. But then I was professor at Viadrina Universitet, and I lived for 2 years in Frankfurt Oder. And one day I had a strange meeting. I was sitting in the park, and I met two very old persons who used to be professors at Stasi Academy and Party School in the same city. And they told me, it was 2018, a year ago, they told me a story how they describe the history of Germany after reunification. And it's a totally different discourse, right? Just imagine their approach. Now, my country is divided, and we look at Germany and we study German experience, also of experience of reunification. Now, I would like to ask you how you see the three best lessons, good and bad, of reintegration. What happened after the fairy tale, after the reunification? What was done well and what was done wrong? And what would you not recommend us to do? Thank you.
Well, that's a challenging question. Three best, three worst. My first foreign posting as a diplomat was in Prague in the mid-1990s, and I saw the Czech Republic. Basically, I saw Czechoslovakia disintegrate into two, but then also the Czech Republic transforming, Prague transforming as a city before my eyes. And I've often compared, because a lot of my Czech friends would have very good knowledge of East Germany. That's what they knew. Their experience and the East German experience of transformation. And there were those also already in those days who envied the East Germans for having the big brother with all those resources helping them to transform quicker. So the whole question of material adaptation or equality has moved much faster in East Germany than it did in the countries of Central Eastern Europe. But some of them already saw that there would also be a psychological cost involved, because if you don't do it yourself, but there are others who come in and tell you how to do things in the new system, that has a psychological cost that I think is more apparent today than it was to us in the 1990s, because people will say, well, this was, we fought for our freedom ourselves. We were the courageous ones in the streets of Leipzig who faced down sort of our own fear of death and army and police of a repressive East German state. And then after unification, all of these Westerners came in and basically took the top jobs and told us what to do and how to do it and got the best jobs for themselves. And that's very much an East German story, not of everyone, but of a lot of people. And it's a story you will not find in the same way in the Czech Republic or in other countries in Central Europe. So I'm not sure that's something to copy or not to copy, but I think again, I think there are limits to what you can credibly fix from the outside. Sort of, you can rebuild cities, you can reconstruct infrastructure, but the way people think about such a disruption in their own lives and how they came to terms with it is something they have to do. And so we one of the projects my president has done is to try to tell stories, put someone from West and East and have them tell their story and compare the story, because there are so many untold stories of those days. And a lot of them have a positive element, but a lot of them are also just about disruption and very existential uncertainty in those days. I think, the East Germans have gone through job losses, retraining, new jobs, probably 95% of them, whereas in the West that is a much more limited experience. So both economically and family-wise, the East has lost of its 17 million people it had when the wall fell. It lost, I think, 2.5 million to emigration in the West in the first years. And I think 2017 or 2018 was the first year when, on balance, more people moved from West to East than from East to West. But there's been a huge brain drain, especially of young people from East to West during the 1990s, which also has had its consequences on deteriorating infrastructure, a sharper divide of urban and rural areas in East Germany, and so things we struggle with today.
May I? Liana. No. Pilar Bonet from Spain. Well, I've been dealing with the wall for many years, and it happened that I was in a pit, in a coal pit in Donbass, the day the wall fell. And going back from Donetsk to Moscow, the people in my train were saying, "Oh, they are lucky East Germans, because every East German has two West Germans who are waiting for him or her with open arms. But we are not so lucky. We don't have anybody who will meet us with open arms in Europe." So my point is that I think that there has been an overstatement and about the fall of the wall. I don't want to be anybody's advocate, but I really think that the fall of the wall was not an universal criteria, or at least, if it is an universal criteria, it's not the only one, because you have to remember that in 1991 the Soviet Union collapsed, and nobody helped. There was no Marshall Plan. I don't say whether it was needed or not needed, but I wanted to say that Europe from the Atlantic to the Vladivostok was not a reality. This is used in propaganda now, but it is also a reality. The fall of the Soviet Union is a criteria for the people who live in that country, for good or for bad. And there are a lot of people who feel they lost their country, a country they thought it existed. Yeah, and I am not saying that I'm not making any moral criteria, as I said. Yeah? But I think that we have to look at things also from that point of view. And we are caught between two data, 89 and 91. And this is not only something which is made up. I was recently in a debate about history in the German History Center in Moscow. There were people from Germany, from both Germanys, and there were people from Russia, mixed. But there were two main lines. One of them was resentment, and the other one was emotions. We were so happy. We didn't even expect that, but that came on us, and we accepted it. And now everybody wants to be good when it looks at his or her own biography. We all want to believe that we were heroes, that we fought about violence, that we could be killed in that demonstration or the other one. So we have to take into consideration emotions and geography. The whole Eurasian continent, and also to finish with it, I want to remember that there is one person who has written about it, but I think it can be developed much more. It's Svetlana Alexievich, the Nobel Prize, who talk about the different experiences of the end of the Soviet Union. And I think this is a very important book because it makes people think it opens people curiosity to which you refer. We have to be more curious and look around and not so be so self-centered as Europe is many times. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think I think I tried to make essentially that argument that you've just brought forward. And it actually, it came to me in an unlikely place in the residence of the German ambassador in Delhi in India, where I had a conversation for about 3 or 4 years back, but it was after Crimea, Donbass, and it was an Indian colleague who said, if you Germans wouldn't make 1989 the pivotal point of everything, you would not have so much trouble coming to terms with the world today. And I remember that in that discussion, I was pushing back and sort of defending my own reading of 1989 as that life-changing event. And then on the flight back, I sort of reflected and said, well, what if he has a point? And it is from then on that my own thinking has developed on that. And that's why I said, I think we Germans have at least had, I think we still have, a tendency to over-universalize our own particular historical experience for good reasons, but it leads you intellectually, it leads you to questionable conclusions. And my argument is, in the end, that takes nothing away from the importance of 1989, either for us or for the European Union, nor for the universal lesson of 1989, in which I would insist that the unthinkable can actually happen and that it does represent hope even under the most adverse circumstances. But we can, I've had this experience in South Korea where we have lots of exchanges between Germans and South Koreans, and they want to hear how it happened and how we did it. And we are happy to tell our story because we think there is a lesson in there that they can copy. And I remember I sat there and I said, it may well happen, even in Korea, but I'm certain it will happen in a very different way than it happened in Germany. And be it only for the fact that a number of the actors will make sure that it doesn't happen in the same way. The North Koreans, the Chinese, the Russians, others, they don't want that event to repeat itself in the same way. So it's the trap of this linear thinking. And on the other point, I fully agree. I mean, I think what you said about Russia, however you look at their perspective on 1991, which was for most of them more life-changing than 1989, is one that has also been informed by, I think, disruption that is very difficult to comprehend as a West German, as I have grown up. And so when I take that again for the German context, I think, and to your question, I mean, one of the things that was inherent in this idea that we had in this end of history idea, we had finally arrived at our destination, is also that the East Germans would change during the process of unification, but the West Germans wouldn't. And the state in which the West Germans had grown up also wouldn't change. It would just become sort of somewhat bigger and we add 17 million people, but that's it. But that's not true. I'll take the example of your country now, but a Ukraine without Donbass and the people of Donbass is a different country than a country with Donbass and the people of Donbass. It makes for sort of different stories, different traditions, different ideas about the future, different set of priorities, and it does change the country. And that is something we discovered. We moved our capital from Bonn to Berlin. That was also a change. And in the end, it was, over the course of 20 years, it was more than simply a change of geographical center of your government. It does change the way you look at the rest of the world. Sort of France is a little further away. Poland is a little closer than it used to be to us. That over time, that changes your perspective. And so I think in that respect, the way, to me, that has also something to do with a sense of openness and curiosity. How do they change the place I grew up in, and not just they change because they have to adapt to the way I grew up and the country I lived in.
Herr Bagger, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. My name is Konstantin Agat, and I'm a journalist. I said I'm Konstantin Agat. I'm a journalist, and first of all, you asked us not to inform our lives with self-doubt. So this is an advice I would like to address to you. Don't pay attention to what a silly Indian politician, who is, as most Indian politicians are, informed by anti-Western resentment and anti-Americanism, told you about 1989. You shouldn't be doubting about this particular date. I think, as a German and as a German official, I think that Germany probably has quite a few things to apologize for, but definitely not 1989. As for what Pilar, my good friend, said, well, let me be a bit provocative. I think that this issue of Russians not understanding 1989, by the way, I agree, it's not a date in Russia at all, has a lot to do with the Russians not being able to internalize their past and to figure out one simple thing, that East Germany was occupied by their country, which installed a brutal dictatorship there, just as it was in the Baltic states, just as it was in Poland and a few other bits and pieces of Central and Eastern Europe. So you still can hear, yes, these ordinary Russians saying on a train or on the bus, oh, you know, we shouldn't have given away Germany, as if Germany was ever theirs to give away. And I suppose that this is a big problem for Russia, which has to figure out a lot of things in its past before moving on to present. But I have three questions to you, essentially. That is the most interesting thing for me. First and foremost of all, you mentioned the current American administration a few times. To me, it's interesting how much the Europeans are now fixated in it. And I still remember as they were fixated on George W. Bush. But Donald Trump will be probably gone in a year, probably in 5 years. But what about transatlantic relationship? Do you think that this trend that we see today is something that is very specific to Trump and his worldview, or it's something that started under the previous administration, will continue to move on later? And then what is the remedy? Question number two is very simple. Do you envisage, we are talking about European integration, and most people agree that in the end, Western Balkans will be part of the European Union. What's your message, or what do you think about those countries that really want to join, but definitely have a glass partition in front of them, and that is Ukraine, Georgia, and first and foremost, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, 3 countries of the 6 in the European, the whole European neighborhood policy, Eastern Partnership. And number 3, don't you think that from time to time references to the Kaczynski government or to Orban are just a very convenient way in Paris, and I'm afraid in this city from time to time too, and I'm not talking about your boss, of course, to dismiss their worldview and the view of Central Eastern Europe and the Baltics with regard to Putin and with regard to China? Because, I mean, let's face it, I very frequently hear these remarks that, oh, you know, the Poles and the Balts are as always panicking about this and that, and we have to maintain dialogue and do stuff, and, you know, it's always very dismissive. So, do you think when time will come when this kind of humility which you called for will be also promoting a more cohesive view, because inside the EU with regard to the East, with regard to modern Russia, for example, because from now, currently I see that there are 2 narratives in Europe, and not one with regard to Russia. Thank you. Really sorry to bother you with that.
Yeah, that's fine. And I take the point about self-doubt as well. I think in the end, you know, I think it is, if you believe something to be inevitable, you lose your ability to look at yourself self-critically, and I think that's a real loss. I think too much self-certainty is a trap as well. But as I said, self-doubt is too much of it and a weakness. And so it is always a question of the right balance. And one of the phrases that stuck with me is sort of victors lose their curiosity. And I think in many ways after 1989 there was a not a triumphalism on the international stage. I wouldn't argue that, but sort of internally you lose your curiosity because you think others will become like you, or they have to, and then you lose your ability to really understand what is going on. And I think that's part of our difficulties also with Central Eastern Europe, but I'll come to that. I start with the first one on sort of the fixation of Europeans with the current US administration. I'll be very brief on that one, but I think that I don't think that Donald Trump is reflective of the American attitude towards Germany and Europe. But I also don't think that a US administration post-Trump will return to a status quo ante in transatlantic relations. So I think we need to realize the particular challenge of this administration, which, as I said, is not interested in the success of the European integration project. But we should not lose sight of the fact that beyond these particular attitudes, Europe will, in the foreseeable future, not again be central to the American sort of posture in the world. In an American perspective, the challenges will lie elsewhere. And we can see that already in the sort of how the confrontational relationship with China is becoming the organizing principle of American foreign policy thinking from the left to the right end of the spectrum. And that is something Europeans will have to address. And on that, I agree with you. So we as Europeans, we will have to do more for ourselves, irrespective of who will be the next president or how long this president will still be in office. And I think that's important for our own debate. We don't do things because of Trump, or we say we don't do it because of Trump, but really to see the structural shifts that are underway also in the American political debate. On the second question, which is politically the most interesting, the most difficult for me, sort of, I mean, what is it that I can say in these days in the direction of countries on the Western Balkans or Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova? Not very much, really. We thought we had as clear a case as you can imagine for starting accession negotiations with Northern Macedonia, but it didn't come to that yet. So, who am I to say it will happen next year or later? I was in Georgia with my president in early October for a visit. And I felt that was very interesting because because so much is happening. There are so many close ties between Georgia and Germany, academic, cultural, economic. There's visa-free travel. There's lots of things that happen, lots of changes that happen in Georgia. But when you talk in public or in front of the media, there's only one question. Sort of, when can we enter the EU and NATO? And what will you do to support it? Or are you on the Russian side? So it's essentially an either-or question to which there is no answer, no satisfying, no convincing answer. And sort of we came away and said, in the end, it's a pity, because this is a country in which a lot happens on the social level. You can do plenty more of strengthening the ties of Georgia and Germany, and it is actually happening, but it all gets lost because there is sort of the either-or question that dominates everything. On your last point, on the dismissive attitude of Western Europeans, or Germans for that matter, when it comes to Central Europe, I mean, I consider myself a pretty consistent advocate of Central and Eastern Europe in Berlin. And it's partly informed by my own experience that I grew up with my back to the East, very transatlantic, as a very Francophile youth. And I didn't have an idea about the East, but I spent some time there. I learned my Czech. I sort of got an idea of how these people looked at Germany as a neighbor that's too big, too close, too overpowering, too many, certainly too close over the centuries, and thought I understood something about my own country through Czech eyes and their own skepticism. But it is for that very reason that my president invited the presidents of the Visegrad 4 countries from Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary to celebrate in Berlin on the 9th of November and to say, without what had happened with Solidarność in Poland, but also in Hungary and other places, the 9th of November would not have happened that way in Germany. And so there is a way to acknowledge the decisions that have been taken by Mikhail Gorbachev in the Kremlin in those days and by a very enlightened George Bush senior administration in Washington in those days leading up to unification. But clearly there's also been a contribution by the countries and societies in Central Eastern Europe. And I think, I don't want to contradict you on what you've said entirely, but I think it's the lack of curiosity. We were not, if they would become like us, why would we need to go there and try to find out what makes them tick? And that is, I think, what has hampered us to understand how they arrived at where they are today. So I think we have every reason to go there, to travel there, to talk to them, to understand how they think and what makes them tick. But I also think that there's nowhere near a universal dismissive attitude in Berlin towards that region. I don't think that's true, because I also think that, also on Russia policy, it's whether you agree with Emmanuel Macron or you don't in his Russia initiative, but it's quite clear that you will get nowhere in the European Union with that debate if you don't find support in Central Eastern Europe for this approach as well. It won't happen without that.
And happy 30th anniversary, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wager, and thank you for coming, and thank you for words of wisdom. I'll do my question in Russian. Спасибо.
Thank you very much for mentioning Ivan Krastev. He's a very close friend of the school personally, and he was the one who opened this forum in Berlin 5 years ago. His latest book, co-authored with Holmes, where he pays great attention to the crisis that now beset Europe and attempts that are made by Eastern Europe to build institutions that were in existence in Western Europe, but this turned into a travesty or imitation institutions, if you will, and crisis finally befell upon everyone and all. And at this time, people like Viktor Orban come out and say, we used to think that Europe is our future, but nowadays we believe that the future of Europe is us. My question is not about the crisis, it's not about Orban. It's about language. Does it not seem to you that when we speak East and West, Europe and Asia, Europe and Russia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, we tend to fix these borders and limits in place. And implicitly we mean standoff, whereas we should instead consider solidarity. So in point of fact, politically, geographically, it might be true, but even what you said, you also just mentioned it, even if we bring together nations and peoples, solidarity will not evolve automatically out of it. But as it seems to me, and we in the school strongly believe in that solidarity occurs when we make this effort and we stand above the borders, above the limits that divide us. And in part, it is a question of language. language cannot be the only way out. But maybe we should make this effort and create new rules in language, new norms as we go beyond these borders and talk about solidarity above and beyond the borders. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is not really so much of a policy question, but I have a lot of sympathy for Ivan's imitation theory. I don't think it explains everything, but it is eye-opening, and it certainly has a lot to tell us why any expectation of linear adaptation change is mistaken. On your question about language or discourse and borders, I've come across a great little book 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, by a Frenchman called François Julien, which is published in German under the title, it was essentially a lecture published under the title of There is no such thing as cultural identity. And his whole argument is that cultural identity is not something you can sort of close off and as something clearly defined, because once you do that, it is essentially dead. It does not live. Because the only thing that keeps it alive is constant challenge and exchange and sort of being in contact and in tension with others. And so it's not something that you own. And by the way, sort of how do you reconcile Rimbaud and Victor Hugo and sort of every culture in itself, even a national culture, is the product of tensions, of back and forth, of challenge and response. So it's pretty idiotic to claim that you can define that neatly and then you sort of own it. And I, as a German, own German culture, and you have a different one. And instead, he makes this argument of what that really is. It's cultural resources. And these resources are defined by the fact that you can they're open to everyone. Sort of, I can learn through reading Russian novelists about universal human nature, or about my own country, or about the way I think about human interaction, politics, and the world. And the same is true for everyone else. And it's actually a fact that, because the German education system has developed after the war the way it has, that there are plenty more people who read Goethe and Schiller outside of Germany than there are inside of Germany or in German schools. But that's just one example. But he arrives in this little book, it's just 100 pages. His point in the end is very much one about language. And he says the truth of universalism is not that we're all the same, because we're not. And it's not a single language, which is why Esperanto is sort of a dead end in that respect. But the reality is that you discover and explore cultural resources and discourse where you learn something about the other and about yourself through translation. Or even better, if you learn a foreign language. But that is where it happens, where you have one cultural space, if you will, but one that interacts with another one. And we all have sort of words carry different meanings in different languages, even if we do this with translation now here. But so I think I have a lot of sympathy for that. I don't believe in sort of we in the West and they in the East, and to sort of have this categoric idea. And it's not clear that all people who in the end vote for peace or vote for Fidesz or vote for the AfD in Germany, that they all vote for them for the one and same reason. They have lots of very different motivations, own stories, own grievances, own resentments, if you will, own emotions. And I think I come back to that notion of curiosity, which I think is particularly important. And I say that as a German official because this country has done so well over these past 15 years and 30 years, if you will, but particularly the last 15 years, that it is a real risk for us to say, things are difficult in the world and Europe is really important to us, but haven't we done everything right in Germany? I mean, look at well we've done. So shouldn't all the others follow our example? And that's a dangerous trap politically.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael Suhlman. I have the pleasure and honor of being part of the board of the school. Last night we were sitting, a group of people, among them people from Ukraine, and the question arose, what is Germany's position in now running up to the Normandy meeting? In Kiev, in their foreign office, the rumor is that the game is 3 against 1. Putin having France and Germany pushing Ukraine. Then we have the formula which bears the name of your boss. And there are some unclear aspects of this. So if it would be very valuable to listen to your view of what does Germany, and I guess France agrees, stand in front of this discussion which will come up. Second question is, you mentioned, and it came up here already, the ideas of President Macron, his Brégançon vision, and which, as I understand, was met with some slight surprise here in Berlin, about a new structure somehow, which for the interaction between Russia and the EU. We have already the 5 points which we have agreed upon, but there's something new he envisages. Do we have any view of what that is? Because it wasn't very clear. It could also be interpreted in a Yalta II direction. Thank you.
Well, on the upcoming Normandy summit on the 9th of December in Paris, I'm not part of the deliberations. That is the job of the federal government to do, of the foreign ministry and the chancellery. But I have no memory over the course of these past 5.5 years where there has ever been a 3+1 against Ukraine. And I don't think there's any reason to be concerned about that. I know that there are people in Ukraine who've tried to mobilize domestic protest against their president and his policy, also by using the formula that is associated with the name of my president, the so-called Steinmeier formula. But so it's interesting. I mean, this happened at one of the last Normandy summits in, I think, the autumn of 2015, when there was an attempt to make a step that was impossible to go for the two parties, to divide it into sort of a sequence of smaller steps to make it feasible. It was a matter of the parties to agree to that. And the former Ukrainian president was part of that summit, even if he wants to make everyone believe he wasn't. In the end, it is up to that group to decide what is possible. The reality is that it's the first summit in 3 years. So I think there's a clear ambition of the new Ukrainian leadership to move things, and not just to leave them stuck at where they are. They have made some courageous steps, which have now led to the agreement of this summit. I think, given all the experience of the past few years, we should all be difficult not to overburden that summit with expectations of a grandiose breakthrough. But I think, there could be progress and some steps in a better direction. But on the policy details, I will not I'm in no position to get into that. But all the preparations that are happening now are also very closely consulted with the Ukrainian side. on the French president's initiative on Russia, as I said earlier, there are differences of methods, and there have always been between France and Germany. And if you go through the speech of Macron at his own ambassadors' conference, which takes a while because it was almost a 2-hour speech, but he devotes a large part of it to this question of Russia's options, how he sees them, and what flows from that for France's policy. All of that is very closely linked to an idea that he develops, which is he calls it stratégie de l'audace. It's a strategy of audacity. It's you wage something, you dare something. That is as a method. That is very different from German diplomacy or from the method my chancellor employs. But I think on the substance, I would not, from what I know of the French president and the policies in Paris, I don't see the danger of a new Yalta. And as I said, in the end, there will only be movement on Europe's Russia policy if there is a way to develop a new, broader consensus, and that will not happen without Germany or without the voice of Central and Eastern Europeans. But to say, as Macron did, that given the shift of the focus of the United States in the world, and the fact that Russia is and will always remain a neighbor to the European Union. And therefore, our thinking and our relations with Russia will differ from that of the United States. I have little to quarrel with that. The question is, how do you translate that into practical policies? He has sent his defense minister and foreign minister to Moscow with a number of sort of ideas, a set of five baskets where they intend to work together more closely. But Macron himself has said on a number of occasions, this will take a lot of time. It's not a matter of months; it's a matter of years, maybe a decade. But it's more a way of looking at Russia as something Europe has to engage with, and not simply to shield itself from.
Okay. Hello to everybody. Dragan Nikolic, Croatia. From my first visit to Golitsyn, when I was accepted by all these wonderful people, and that was even before Croatia has become EU member country, Europe has changed a lot. It has lost a lot of its values, I must say, and as well a lot of its solidarity. When I'm talking about that, I'm tackling perhaps the biggest short-term challenge of nowadays Europe, and this is the question of migrations. The newest edition of Politico, and for those ones that do not know, this is the newspapers or the magazine which is the best one informed about EU processes and what happens in the EU, found it out that Germany has sent, they had a chance for the insight on 4-page document of the German government that was sent towards Brussels about automatic relocation of asylum seekers, meaning that its plan or strategy of German government, and we know what was the role of Germany and Madame Merkel in the first wave of migration crisis, and it's imminent that we will witness a second big migration crisis, perhaps this winter. Germany suggests that applications of those asylum seekers would be examined at the EU's external borders. For Croatia, that has the biggest external border, and it's with Bosnia and Herzegovina, this is a huge issue. My question would be for you, is this, because you were talking about Europe, that it's more secure, Europe that needs to redefine many policies, is this the German answer to this imminent and huge challenge that we would witness very shortly, or we are still witnessing, because Bosnia and Herzegovina, perhaps geopolitically it's not Europe, but it's geographically European belly. And in this moment, I'm not sure if you are aware or not, thousands of people are there in camps like animals, without any food, on the open sky, and many of those universal values that we are searching for and talking about, including humanitarian issues, are annihilated. So Germany, its plan for new migration crisis.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I agree with your premise on the loss of a lot of its values or its solidarity in Europe with respect to the migration crisis. I think the reality is that there has at no point really been a joint European approach. There has not been European consensus, and we haven't reached it yet. On very important questions of how to deal with the influx of people. And even in Germany, that issue since 2015, and the large influx of people, of about 1 million people that autumn and into the spring of 2016 has played a major role in repolarizing German politics domestically. But I think, I would come back to something I was trying to say earlier about a need for humility and to realize also the limits of our own capabilities. The influx of a lot of people here has a lot to do with the attractiveness of Europe, some of it material, other much less material, in the sense of safety, dignity, personal integrity, and simply a perspective for life. Does that mean Europe can take all these people irrespective of their motivations? No. That is part of the limits of our capabilities. I think that is my answer would be we need to be better, and that includes Germany, but basically means the European Union, to distinguish between those who flee from political persecution and war, and where there is a legal obligation to shelter them, and those who come for other good reasons, but in search of a better life, but those are reasons that do not qualify them to choose the place where they want to live by themselves, and there's no obligation to shelter them or to have them immigrate and settle within the European Union. There is no such thing as a universal right to choose your own place of residence around the globe. It doesn't exist in international law, and I don't think it's feasible. I think the challenge on this is it's actually the predecessor of the current German president who's coined the phrase, I think in 2015-16 during the refugee crisis here, who said, our hearts are wide, but our possibilities are limited. And I think to find that balance of what you can actually do, how you can live up to your responsibilities, to the commitments you've entered into in international law, and balance that with the limits of your own capabilities is one of the great challenges we have every day. How do we deal with sort of Libyan authorities south of the Mediterranean? How do we deal with the regime in Egypt? How do we help countries in the Sahel against the deadly transit of thousands of people? This is not politics is not an art where you have your hands clean in the end. It's not, and it cannot be. But you have to find practical compromises. And I think there is a real risk that Europe will fragment over this issue also in the future, because for many, this issue is one that is perfect to whip up domestic sentiments and to use it for political polarization at home. But I think there's I don't see any alternative to try to work along that distinction, to try to get a better sense of who do we think we have an obligation to shelter, and how do we do that across the European Union, and how do we deal with the problem of those that would like to come to Europe, but that we have neither an obligation nor the possibilities to help to a better life. And that is an issue also for the protection of external borders. That doesn't preclude legal immigration into the European Union, but it's something that has to be regular and not irregular. Yeah.
Last question of this session will come from Kazakhstan.
Alexander Danilov, I'm from Kazakhstan. In Central Asia, we have very big changes. In Uzbekistan changed their president in 2016, and we changed president in this year. So we think that Europe and Russia too, you lost baby in water, because every time you discuss about Ukraine, about crisis, but I think that the biggest guilty victim of anti-Russia sanctions is our countries, because we lost money, we lost our course. So I want to ask you, what will be next steps of Germany and European Union in Central Asia? Because we know that Russia has some players in our policy and our economic. China that surround us has very big money to work with us, but Europe playing only with business, but not with values, with our country, with our civil society. So, what will be next in policy of European Union and Germany in our country, and our region, Central Asia? Thank you.
Thank you. I've done one of the most impressive trips I have done this year, and it was my first ever, was to Uzbekistan at the end of May with the president, where we spent 3 days. And it's a fascinating story, because the new president of Uzbekistan was part of a pretty repressive authoritarian regime, but he is now the one sort of opening the windows and essentially trying to push for a top-down reform. And it's interesting because when you compare it to a place like Ethiopia, where you have a young, ambitious prime minister trying to transform the country, but with almost messianic hopes of a population of 100 million, you wonder sort of how he can manage these enormous expectations. In Uzbekistan, you have a very different sentiment, because people don't want to return to the old days of a repressive police state. But they have positive but rather muted expectations about the future. This gives the president sort of quite a bit of space to maneuver and some time to make good on his promises of a more open society. But it's very much a top-down modernization that I felt was happening there. Trying to open up, they will have elections now, I think on the 22nd of December, first reasonably free elections in many, many years. How will that help to generate some movement for more reforms? So we were there with a large business delegation, but also with some university presidents and museum directors and so forth to actually try to intensify cooperation and exchange with Uzbekistan, and there's a lot of openness on their part, exactly for the reasons you describe. They don't want to be left only with Russia and China as the two actors in their own country, in terms of investment, but also in terms of perspective and opportunities. So there is a broader European effort on Central Asia. I'm not in a position to tell you how substantive that is at the moment, but I think we are very open. I've had an Uzbek delegation just last week in my office, briefing us on on the further reform steps on a number of projects that we've agreed on. So there's a lot happening there, and the new Kazakh president will be our guest at Bellevue on the 5th of December. We've been to Kazakhstan. It is the richer country than Uzbekistan. It's sort of further progressed, but we will see. It will be one of the issues for discussion. How serious and how far the president is willing to go, also on his promises of a more open society, and not just of trying to attract German Western investment. So we'll see. We should talk after the 5th of December.
Thomas, on behalf of everybody here, thank you for this brilliant session, a session replete with both presentation and discussion. And on behalf of us all, if I may, I would like to emphasize that in our countries, we do have professionals, people who are thinking about strategy, but often, quite unfortunately, their beliefs and plans are too dependent on the political will of the moment. And it is the more so precious to have an official, in the particular case, an official of the German government, talking from the position of principle. This is a darling experience, and what we are trying to bring into life, something that we trust, is often put in doubt, and certainly under a very stringent test. But it is very important, and as I said, precious to us to meet in your figure one official who does share our perception of the universal values. And because this school is, after all, not about politics, but about human dimension, the humanity in us, even insofar as the politics are concerned, I would like to say once again, the words of optimism and pessimism have sounded during this session, but my favorite philosopher, Merab Mamardashvili, the Georgian philosopher, liked to repeat, there's no optimism and pessimism. There is skepticism of the mind, and optimism of the will. This is what this school stands for. The morals and the humanity, the humane in us, and the optimism of this will. Thomas, thank you so very much for this morning session.